The studio lights were hotter than usual that night. Not just physically, but in a way that made even seasoned performers pause for half a second longer than normal before stepping into the spotlight. The kind of heat that comes when something unspoken hangs in the air. The kind of tension that audiences can't explain, but they feel it. Backstage, Dean Martin stood near a dressing mirror, adjusting his cufflinks with that same effortless calm he was known for. To the outside world, Dean was always relaxed, half-smile, drink in hand, never rushed, never shaken. But tonight was different. Not because he was nervous, because he knew something most people in that building didn't. Across the hall in another dressing room, Elvis Presley sat quietly, staring at his reflection. The king of rock and roll, the man who could shake arenas with a single step, who could send crowds into a frenzy with just a glance, was uncharacteristically still. No music. No movement. Just silence. The producers outside whispered among themselves. "This is going to break records," one of them said. "Or break something else," another replied. Because this wasn't just another TV appearance. This was a moment people had been waiting for, whether they knew it or not. Two worlds were about to collide. The setup no one could ignore. The show itself was built like any other variety program of the era. Music, laughter, charm, and just enough unpredictability to keep audiences hooked. But tonight's lineup had one detail that changed everything. Dean Martin and Elvis Presley on the same stage. Not as competitors. Not as collaborators. Just present. That alone was enough to create headlines. Because their styles couldn't have been more different. Dean Martin represented control, smoothness, precision, a voice that didn't need to shout to be heard. Elvis Presley represented energy, movement, a storm wrapped in rhythm, a force that couldn't be contained. Two legends, two identities, two completely different ways of owning a stage. And everyone in that studio, from the camera crew to the writers, knew one thing. Moments like this don't stay ordinary for long. A quiet conversation before the storm. 10 minutes before the show went live, the hallway outside the dressing rooms went silent. Dean stepped out first. Elvis followed a few seconds later. For a brief moment they stood there, face to face. No cameras. No audience. Just two men who had both reached heights most people only dream of. Dean broke the silence first. "Long night ahead," he said casually. Elvis gave a small nod. "Yeah, looks that way." There was no tension in their voices. But there was weight. Because both of them understood something deeper than fame. They understood expectation. The kind that doesn't come from fans, but from history itself. What the audience didn't see. Out front, the crowd was buzzing. People leaned forward in their seats, whispering, pointing, speculating. "Do you think they'll perform together? Is this planned or just coincidence? Something's going to happen, I can feel it." And they were right. But not in the way they expected. Because the most powerful moments aren't always loud. Sometimes they're quiet. The show begins. The host walked out to applause. The music swelled. The cameras rolled. "Ladies and gentlemen," the announcer said with a smile that barely hid his excitement, "tonight we have something special for you." The audience cheered. But there was a slight pause before he continued. The kind of pause that builds anticipation. Two legends, one stage. That's all he said. He didn't need to say more. Dean takes the stage. Dean Martin walked out first. Smooth as ever. No rush, no extra movement. Just presence. He greeted the audience with a slight nod, adjusted the microphone, and began to sing. His voice filled the room, not overpowering, not aggressive, just controlled. Every note landed exactly where it needed to. The crowd settled into his rhythm. Calm, steady, mesmerized. But behind the curtain, Elvis was watching. Not as a fan, not as a rival, but as someone who understood exactly what he was seeing. Discipline, mastery, a different kind of power. The moment everything shifted. When Dean finished, the applause was strong. Respectful. Earned. He stepped back slightly and glanced toward the side of the stage. That was the cue. Elvis Presley walked out, and the energy changed instantly. It wasn't gradual. It wasn't subtle. It was immediate. The crowd erupted. The calm turned into electricity. The steady rhythm turned into anticipation. Because Elvis didn't just walk onto a stage. He transformed it. Two worlds collide. For a brief moment, they stood side by side. Dean Martin, Elvis Presley. No music. No script. Just presence. And that's when it happened. Dean leaned slightly toward Elvis. The microphones were still live. The audience quieted down just enough, and in a voice calm enough to almost disappear into the moment. He said 5 words. Words that weren't loud, weren't dramatic, but carried more weight than anyone expected. The audience didn't fully catch them, but Elvis did. And for the first time that night, the king of rock and roll didn't move, didn't speak, didn't react the way everyone thought he would. He just paused, a silence that meant everything. It lasted only a few seconds. But in live television, a few seconds can feel like forever. The band hesitated. The host looked confused. The audience leaned forward. Because something had shifted. Something real. Something unscripted. And in that silence, a different kind of respect was born. What no one understood yet. The show moved on. The music returned. The energy came back. But something had changed. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But quietly, deeply. Because moments like that don't need explanation. They don't need headlines. They don't need replay. They just exist. And for the people who were there, they never forget. The applause came back. The music picked up. The show continued as if nothing had happened. But for Elvis Presley, nothing was the same. He moved through the rest of the segment like a professional, every step timed, every gesture controlled, every note delivered exactly the way the audience expected. If you were sitting in that studio, you would have seen the same Elvis everyone knew. But if you were close enough, you would have noticed the difference. A half-second pause before the first note. A glance not at the audience, but somewhere inward. A shift so subtle, it almost didn't exist. Almost. What Dean actually said. Those 5 words were not loud. They were not designed for the audience. They were not meant to create a moment. They were meant for one person. Dean Martin leaned in, just enough for Elvis to hear, and said, "They love you, but do you?" No sarcasm. No challenge. No judgment. Just a question. And sometimes, a question is heavier than any statement. The performance that looked the same, but was. Elvis began to sing. The crowd erupted like always. Cheers, movement, energy. From the outside, it was perfect. But inside his mind, something had shifted. Not because the words were harsh. Because they were simple. Too simple to ignore. Too honest to deflect. He had heard praise his entire life. You're the greatest. You're unstoppable. You changed everything. But this wasn't praise. This was something else. The first crack in the rhythm. Halfway through the performance, something unusual happened. Not obvious. Not enough to alarm the audience. But enough for the band to notice. Elvis held a note just a fraction longer than expected. The guitarist glanced up. The drummer adjusted instinctively. They recovered instantly, because that's what professionals do. But that tiny shift, it wasn't part of the act. It was hesitation. Backstage where the truth lives. The moment the segment ended, Elvis didn't stay. No waving to the audience. No extra charm for the cameras. He walked off stage, quickly but not dramatically. Just intentionally. Backstage, the noise faded. The bright lights disappeared. And what remained was silence. He reached his dressing room, closed the door, and for the first time that night, he stopped performing. He sat down, looked at his hands, and for a moment he didn't move at all. A question that doesn't leave. They love you, but do you? It wasn't about music. It wasn't about fame. It was something deeper. Because for the first time in a long time, Elvis wasn't thinking about the audience. He was thinking about himself. The long tour. The endless expectations. The pressure to be perfect every single time. And somewhere in that reflection, a realization began to form. Not loud, not dramatic, but steady. Meanwhile, Dean knew exactly what he had done. Down the hallway, Dean Martin sat calmly, as if nothing unusual had happened. A drink rested on the table beside him. His posture was relaxed, but his eyes told a different story. Because Dean didn't say those words by accident. He wasn't trying to challenge Elvis. He wasn't trying to create a scene. He recognized something. Something only someone with experience could see. The difference between performing and carrying something heavy behind the performance. Dean had seen it before. In other artists. In other moments. And sometimes, all it takes is one sentence to make someone see it too. The producer's concern. In the control room, confusion had already started spreading. Did something go wrong? One producer asked. No, the audience loved it, another replied. But there was a pause, the first insisted. They replayed the moment. Watched closely. Listened carefully. But the microphones hadn't picked up Dean's words clearly. To them, it was just a strange beat of silence. An unexplainable hesitation. They moved on. Because television doesn't wait. But Elvis couldn't move on that easily. Back in his dressing room, the noise of the show continued faintly in the distance. But it felt far away. Disconnected. Like it belonged to someone else. Elvis stood up slowly. Walked to the mirror. Looked at his reflection. The same face millions recognized. The same presence that filled arenas. But now, there was a question behind it. Not about the audience. Not about success. About himself. A memory resurfaces. For a brief moment, something from years earlier came back to him. A younger version of himself. Before the fame. Before the expectations. Before the pressure. Just music. Just passion. Just simplicity. And the contrast was impossible to ignore. The return to the stage. A knock on the door broke the silence. 2 minutes, someone said from outside. Elvis didn't answer immediately. He took one more look in the mirror. Took a breath. And then, he nodded to himself. Not confidently. Not uncertainly. Just thoughtfully. When he stepped back onto the stage, the audience reacted exactly the same way. Cheers. Energy. Excitement. But something inside him had changed. And even if no one else could see it yet, it was there. The moment that no one expected next. Later in the show, there was an unscheduled moment. No script. No cue. Just timing. Dean and Elvis crossed paths again, this time under brighter lights with the audience fully watching. And for a second, it felt like something might happen. A response. A reaction. A continuation of that quiet exchange. The crowd sensed it. They leaned forward. Waiting. But Elvis didn't speak. Not yet. Because some responses don't come instantly. A silence that meant more than words. Instead, he did something else. Something smaller. Something quieter. He gave Dean a look. Not confusion. Not disagreement. Understanding. And in that brief exchange, something passed between them that no audience could fully grasp. The show ended the way all great shows do. With applause, with smiles, with the illusion that everything had gone exactly as planned. The audience stood, the band wrapped up the final notes, the host delivered his closing line with polished ease, cameras faded out. And just like that, it was over. But for Elvis Presley, it hadn't even begun to settle. The silence after the noise. The moment the cameras cut, the energy collapsed. What had been a room full of sound became a corridor of footsteps, cables being rolled up, voices fading into routine. But Elvis didn't join the post-show rhythm. He didn't linger, didn't celebrate, didn't replay the performance with anyone. He walked off the stage quietly, almost unnoticed this time, and disappeared into the same hallway where everything had started. Only now, it felt different. He wasn't walking as the king. He was walking as a man trying to understand something he couldn't shake. A door that stayed closed. Back in his dressing room, the door shut again. But this time it stayed shut. No assistants. No managers. No interruptions. Just silence. Elvis loosened his collar, sat down slowly and leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. The room still carried the faint echo of applause, but it felt distant now, like something that belonged to another version of him. "They love you, but do you?" The words hadn't faded. If anything, they had gotten louder. What fame does protect you from. For years, Elvis had lived in a world where everything was amplified. Every success, every mistake, every movement. But there was one thing that fame couldn't protect him from. Honest reflection, because praise can surround you so completely that it becomes a shield. A barrier between who you are and who people believe you to be. And Dean had just broken through that barrier in 5 quiet words. Meanwhile, Dean walked away. Across the building, Dean Martin didn't wait around. He didn't check reactions. Didn't ask producers how the show performed. Didn't replay the moment. He simply put on his coat, nodded to a few familiar faces, and walked out. No urgency. No hesitation. Just calm. Because Dean understood something most people didn't. When you say something real, you don't need to explain it. The city outside didn't know. Outside, the night was alive. Lights flickered across the streets. Cars moved in steady rhythm. People laughed, talked, celebrated. To the world, it was just another night. Another show. Another successful broadcast. But inside one dressing room, something far more important was unfolding. A memory that refused to stay quiet. Elvis stood up again, walked to the mirror, but this time he didn't just look at his reflection. He studied it, as if searching for something. And then, another memory surfaced. Not from years ago this time. From earlier that same night. The exact moment Dean leaned in. The tone of his voice. The absence of ego. The absence of performance. There was no showmanship in those words. No attempt to impress. Just truth. And that's what made them impossible to ignore. The first real question. Elvis spoke quietly, barely above a whisper. Do I? It wasn't directed at anyone. There was no one there to answer. But the question existed now. And once a question like that takes hold, it doesn't leave easily. The weight behind the crown. For the first time in a long time, Elvis wasn't thinking about the audience's expectations. He was thinking about his own. About the constant need to deliver. To maintain the image. To meet the standard that had been built around him. And somewhere in that reflection, he realized something uncomfortable. He had been giving everything to the world. But he hadn't stopped to ask what he was keeping for himself. An unexpected visitor. A soft knock broke the silence. Elvis didn't respond immediately. The knock came again. Hey, you in there? The voice was familiar. Calm, unhurried. It was Dean. For a moment, Elvis considered staying silent, letting the moment pass. But something inside him shifted. Yeah, he finally said. The door opened slowly. Dean stepped in, not dramatically, not like someone entering a scene. Just like a man checking in. No performance this time. They stood there for a second. No audience. No cameras. No expectations. Just two men. Dean glanced around the room, then back at Elvis. You did good out there, he said simply. Elvis gave a small nod. Yes, I know. But his voice carried something different. Not confidence. Not doubt. Something in between. Dean noticed. Of course he did. The conversation that wasn't planned. Didn't mean to throw you off, Dean said, leaning slightly against the wall. Elvis shook his head. You didn't. A pause. Then Elvis added, quieter this time. You just made me think. Dean smiled slightly, not wide, not exaggerated. Just enough to acknowledge the moment. That's usually enough, he said. The truth beneath the surface. Elvis looked at him directly now. For what it's worth, I don't know the answer. Dean didn't respond immediately. He let the silence sit. Because sometimes, silence does more than words. Then he said, You don't have to know it tonight. A shift that couldn't be reversed. That sentence didn't solve anything. Didn't give clarity. Didn't offer direction. But it did something else. It removed pressure. And in that moment, Elvis felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Space. The exit that meant more than the entrance. Dean pushed himself off the wall, adjusted his coat, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, he paused for just a second. Just make sure, he said without turning back, that you're not only singing for them. And then he was gone. No dramatic exit. No lingering moment. Just gone. What stayed behind? The room was quiet again. But it wasn't the same kind of silence as before. This time, it felt different. Not heavy. Not overwhelming. Just open. Elvis sat down once more. But this time he wasn't searching. He was thinking. And slowly, something began to change. The night ended quietly. No headlines captured it. No cameras replayed it. No audience fully understood it. But something had shifted, and it didn't fade when the lights went out. For Elvis Presley, the real moment didn't happen on stage. It happened after. The morning that didn't feel the same. The next morning came like any other. Sunlight through the curtains. A schedule waiting. Phones ringing somewhere in the distance. But Elvis didn't move right away. He sat on the edge of the bed, still, as if time itself had slowed down just enough to let him think. Not about the performance. Not about the applause. About the question, they love you, but do you? It wasn't echoing anymore. It was settled. Sitting there waiting. A routine that suddenly felt different. For years, Elvis's days followed a rhythm. Wake up. Prepare. Perform. Repeat. A cycle built on expectation. A system that worked. A system that made him who he was. But that morning, that system felt unfamiliar. Not wrong. Just incomplete. Because once you start asking a real question, routine stops being automatic. The first decision no one noticed. He canceled a meeting. Nothing dramatic. Nothing public. Just a simple change. But for someone like Elvis, even a small shift in schedule meant something. It meant he was choosing time. Time to think. Time to feel. Time to exist outside the performance. And that was new. Meanwhile, Dean moved on. Across the city, Dean Martin had already stepped into another day. Another show. Another room. Another audience. To anyone watching, it looked like nothing had happened. And in a way, that was true. Because Dean never needed moments to be seen. He understood something most people missed. The most important changes happen quietly. The place where it all started. Later that day, Elvis found himself somewhere unexpected. Not a studio, not a stage, not surrounded by people. Just a simple room with a piano. No audience, no pressure, no expectation. He sat down slowly, placed his hands on the keys, and for the first time in a long time, he didn't play for anyone else. The sound that was different. The first note came softly. Not powerful. Not polished. Just real. Then another's. Then another's. There was no performance in it. No need to impress. No need to prove anything. Just music. And in that moment, something returned. Not fame. Not energy. Something deeper. Connection. The realization that took time. It didn't come all at once. There was no sudden clarity. No dramatic breakthrough. Just a gradual understanding. That loving what you do isn't the same as being loved for it. And somewhere along the way, those two things had separated. A letter that was never sent. That evening, Elvis sat down with a piece of paper. He wasn't planning anything. Wasn't preparing for anything. He just started writing. Not lyrics. Not notes. Thoughts. Questions. Fragments of realization. At the top of the page, he wrote one line. I forgot to ask myself. He stared at it for a long time. Then folded the paper. Set it aside. And never showed it to anyone. The next performance. A few days later, Elvis stepped onto another stage. Different city. Different audience. Same expectations. But something had changed. Not in a way people could immediately describe. But they felt it. The energy was still there. The movement. The voice. But underneath it, there was something quieter. More grounded. More intentional. The moment only a few noticed. Halfway through the performance, Elvis paused. Not because he had to. Because he chose to. He looked out at the crowd. Thousands of people. All watching. All waiting. And for a brief moment, he smiled. Not the rehearsed smile. Not the expected one. A real one. Small, but unmistakable. And then he continued. The answer that wasn't spoken. He never said it out loud. Never explained it. Never addressed it in interviews. But in the way he performed after that night. In the way he carried himself. In the way he allowed space between moments. The answer began to show. Slowly, quietly. He didn't need to prove anything anymore. He just needed to feel it again. One last encounter. Weeks later, their paths crossed again. No cameras. No stage. Just coincidence. Elvis saw Dean Martin across the room. This time, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. He walked over. Dean looked up, already half smiling. Well, Dean asked. No pressure. No expectation. Just curiosity. Elvis paused for a second. Then nodded. Not dramatically. Not for effect. Just honestly. Yeah, he said quietly. The 5 words that came back. Dean didn't ask anything else. Didn't need to. Because sometimes, a simple answer is enough. And sometimes, the most powerful responses are the ones that don't need to be heard by everyone. What the world never knew. To the audience, nothing had changed. The performances continued. The music lived on. The legend remained. But beneath all of it, there was something different. Something real. Something that started with 5 quiet words on a live stage. The end that was actually a beginning. That night wasn't about silence. It wasn't about hesitation. It wasn't about a moment that looked unusual on television. It was about something much deeper. A question, an answer, and the space in between. Final line. Because sometimes, the loudest impact in a person's life comes from the quietest words no one else hears.